Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. I am so excited to welcome you to our CSW65 event, the US and the Global Women's Movement, What Will the New Administration Bring? My name is Spogmay Ahmed. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am a global policy advocate with the International Center for Research on Women, or ICRW, and the North America organizing partner for the Women's Major Group. I am so excited to organize this event alongside our co-sponsors, the Global Fund for Women, Fundación para Estudio y Investigación de la Mujer, the Women's Environment and Development Organization, and the Women's Major Group. We have a really incredible lineup of speakers today who influence and inspire my advocacy, and throughout this conversation will help us to understand policy goals for the new US administration and concrete actions to help us achieve them. So I'd like to introduce our four panelists for today. We are fortunate to be joined by Verena Winder, Senior Advisor in the Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues at the US Department of State, Luarkie Adelman, Vice President of Influence and Engagement at Global Fund for Women, Malia Luarkie, Co-founder, organizer, full spectrum doula and breastfeeding lead for Indigenous Women Rising, and Dolan, Program and Advocacy Associate at Women's Environment and Development Organization. The speakers' detailed biographies can also be viewed on the NGO CSW event webpage. So this year's CSW is one of the first opportunities for the Biden-Harris administration to re-engage in multilateral settings and to lay out its human rights, foreign policy, and sustainable development priorities as related to gender equality. And it's also an opportunity for US-based advocates, including our panelists, to advance our vision for a more equitable world and push our government to make tangible commitments. Today's conversation is going to focus on a range of issues, including racial justice, Indigenous women's rights, climate change, and sexual and reproductive health and rights. Since the Biden-Harris administration has entered office, we keep hearing that America is back, but the objective of this event is to dig a bit deeper and examine who and what is America back for. And as the new administration repositions itself at the United Nations and other settings, how will it centralize the communities that continue to be impacted by social and systemic injustices, both in the US and globally? As we approach the end of CSW this week, we're also approaching the start of the Generation Equality Forum next week, which is another opportunity for governments to make commitments to achieving gender equality in line with civil society recommendations and the visions of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. So before I get to the panel, I'd like to introduce a policy brief that ICRW and partners have developed outlining recommendations that the US government can make at the Generation Equality Forum in line with the forum's 6 action coalitions. These include gender-based violence, economic justice and rights, bodily autonomy and sexual and reproductive health and rights, feminist action for climate justice, technology and innovation, and feminist movements and leadership. At the Generation Equality Forum, the US, like other countries, can demonstrate leadership in making transformative commitments in support of women's rights, pledging funding and resources to key areas, expanding civic space, and ensuring response and recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic centralizes the very communities that it has affected the most. This brief is posted on the event page on the NGO CSW platform here in the Zoom chat and can also be found on ICRW's website and social media. We'll have about 25 minutes for audience questions at the end of the event. So as we go along, please feel free to input your questions into the Q&A tab and we'll address them after the discussion. So with that, I'd like to first ask Verena Winder of the Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues to speak about government priorities on gender equality. Verena, what are the key priorities for the Biden-Harris administration as it re-engages in multilateral settings and on women's rights? The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Spogmay. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction, and good morning and good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be tuning in from. My name is Verena Winder. As you just heard, I'm the Senior Advisor in the Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues at the State Department. And I'm thrilled to be here today to share some of our key priorities on gender for the US government, as Spogmay just asked, and also to hear more, of course, from our panelists. I'm really excited to hear from them. So this conversation, of course, comes during what has been an incredibly exciting, but also very busy month for the US government and for all of you on gender-related issues, with lots of exciting developments to guide the road ahead for us. So first, as you all may know, on International Women's Day, President Biden announced an executive order formally establishing the White House Gender Policy Council, which reports directly to President Biden. The council, which will be co-chaired or is co-chaired by Ambassador Julissa Reynoso and its executive director, Jen Klein, represents one of the most significant elevations of gender equality as a priority for an American administration to date. Many of you have heard either Jen or Julissa speak, and so you know how committed they are to making this a true whole of government effort. Second, you may have watched the other big International Women's Day event when our First Lady, Secretary of State Blinken, Ambassador to the UN, Thomas Greenfield, and our office's senior official, Kat Bodevet, hosted the 15th International Women of Courage Awards. We call them the IWOC Awards. This is actually the second time I have served with the Department of State and in this particular office. And still our award ceremony never and will never cease to overwhelm me with awe. The 21 women we honored this year and the more than 150 we have honored in the past are standout examples of what so many women, and especially those from civil society, have to confront, endure, overcome in order to make the world more just. Last week, of course, also we were so proud to have Vice President Harris deliver the US National Statement for the 65th Commission on the Status of Women. This was, of course, the first UN speech for our first ever woman vice president. And in it, she tied this fundamental fact together that the status of women is the status of democracy. President Biden and Vice President Harris have made it clear that advancing gender equity and equality is a matter of human rights and a strategic imperative for the United States. They're both. And it's, of course, never been so important as we grapple with the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, which I'm sure we'll talk about today, and its disproportionate impacts on women and girls. So with all that being said, you asked, kind of to outline some priorities when it comes not only to gender equality, but to engaging in multilateral fora. I'll touch on that briefly first, maybe. So as highlighted, of course, by the Vice President in her CSW remarks, the US is committed to re-engaging multilaterally in a productive and collaborative fashion. So whether that's rejoining the World Health Organization, the Paris Agreement, the Human Rights Council, or any other leading institution, we know that many of our largest challenges, from climate change, global health, confronting humanitarian crises, we may talk about that later today, given what happened yesterday, cannot be addressed in isolation. When it comes to advancing gender equality, my office is closely coordinating with the White House Gender Policy Council and the broader US government along a number of key issues, and I'll touch on each of them just very briefly. First, preventing and responding to gender-based violence is the linchpin to enabling progress on every single other issue. And I think the increase in GBV that we've seen during the COVID pandemic has demonstrated how much further we have to go. If you're not safe at home, if you're not safe in your workplace, for many of us, for many of the most fortunate of us, our workplaces are home, and vice versa. If you're not safe in a public space, if you're not safe, period, empowerment is not attainable. So to that end, we're already hard at work on efforts to coordinate a comprehensive interagency strategy and a related national action plan on GBV. And we're going to, of course, continue to program to address these issues. Second, the administration has indicated its clear commitment to promoting sexual and reproductive health and rights as another priority. The executive order that I mentioned before recognizes that increasing access to comprehensive health care, addressing health disparities, and promoting SRHR are matters of gender equality. The right of individuals to freely and responsibly decide the number, spacing, and timing of their children is a foundational element of sexual and reproductive health and fundamental to empowerment. The US knows that this is critical to address if we want to build back better. So in addition to rescinding the Mexico City policy, we are moving forward right now with steps to restore the $32.5 million in funding to UNFPA, which provides life-saving critical services to so many women and girls, including those affected yesterday. The third priority, of course, is increasing economic security and opportunity, which of course has been a long-standing priority for the US government. We're committed to reducing barriers, enhancing protections and policy, law, regulation, and practice. The GPC, or the Gender Policy Council, has made it clear that this will also include addressing caregiving needs, which we all know have grown substantially through the pandemic. And then tackling climate change will be a top priority for the Biden-Harris administration. We know, of course, that while everyone is impacted by climate change, we know that women and girls will experience its effects disproportionately, even though they have fewer opportunities often to shape solutions for prevention and adaptation. And I would also note that there are some very specific risks for women and girls. We know that women environmental defenders working to protect their communities often do confront numerous very gender-specific threats and violations. With that, I guess I would be remiss if I didn't note that these constitute some of our policy priorities, but the way in which we will be advancing these issues is also critically important. I know ICRW had an event on this yesterday. We know we can achieve more, not only through engagement with other governments bilaterally and through multilateral fora, but with the private sector and with civil society. I know many of you have been working tirelessly on these issues, not only for the past 4 years, but throughout your careers, throughout the history of your organizations. And we are so thankful for your tireless leadership and commitment. So with that, I'll turn it over to the esteemed panel, and just thank you again for having me.
Thank you so much, Verena. It's really refreshing to hear a lot of those words and encouraging to hear about the policy commitments that are being considered and implemented. So I want to now direct the same question to our civil society speakers, Laurie Adelman of Global Fund for Women, Malia Luarkie of Indigenous Women Rising, and Mara Dolan of Women's Environment and Development Organization. So as I mentioned, a new administration and re-engagement offers a lot of potential for policy change and expansion. So speaking to your work, what are the key civil society priorities for the new administration? And I will first pass the mic to Laurie.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Spogmay. And I could not agree more, Varina. It's a breath of fresh air to hear phrases like sexual and reproductive health and rights come out of your mouth. And we're so excited about these changes. So I'm really thrilled to be here today and to be with my esteemed panelists and really looking forward to hearing your contributions as well. As Spogmay mentioned, I work at Global Fund for Women. We are a women's fund, and women's funds are led by and for women, girls, trans people, intersex people, gender binary people in all their diversity. And our core values are feminist and rooted in justice, equality, respect, and accountability. And so that's the framework that I'm bringing to this conversation today. And when we talk about civil society priorities, I think it's really important not to be speaking on behalf of anyone but myself. And it's also really important to remember our history, both recent and not so recent. So how could we forget? I think many of us are still traumatized and reeling from the past 4 years, but it's important to raise in a space like this that the past 4 years resulted in increased precarity in the US and around the world. So like I said, it was so amazing to hear from Verena about the administration's plans to re-engage multilaterally in a productive way. And it's such a relief to hear these terms and these values coming from you. And one of the reasons for that is because for 4 years, the Trump administration was rolling back reproductive rights, the rights of immigrants, LGBTQI people, people of color, people of faith, and many more. And the administration also exported its deadly anti-choice policies around the globe, especially through the reinstatement and expansion of the global gag rule. Many of us saw them quietly expanding the global gag rule to apply to all global health contracts even though the State Department's own report found that the global gag rule dangerously disrupts access to healthcare, and 70% of Americans feel that it should be repealed. So I think many of us knew in civil society that the US election had so many consequences, not only for women, but for all historically marginalized people from Montgomery, Alabama to Harare, Zimbabwe. And we really can't forget that we have a majority of both chambers due to Georgia's state elections, which was a victory from a multiracial coalition led by Black women and including Latinx, Asian Americans, and more community organizers. So we cannot squander this opportunity, right? Civil society has great hope that the new administration offers a new path forward, but to Spogmay's question, who are we back for? And that is an amazing, I think, great framing for this conversation, because it's not only from Trump that we're reeling. It's not only been 4 years that the precarity and the hurt and the oppression has been coming. So to me, feminist foreign policy really means that we must also recognize that a lot of the issues that foreign policy itself aims to fix and address are there to begin with due to colonialism, due to white supremacy, due to the violent insertion of American culture, politics, and values through, again, violence and through exploitation. And so we see that historically, policies from the United States did not hurt communities in all the same way. For example, just looking at the global gag rule itself, it disrupted health service for millions, but especially young women and girls, LGBTQI communities, and sex workers are groups that were not as discussed in the implications of the global gag rule, and those that are HIV positive. So in short, when we're thinking about a feminist foreign policy today, and with this exciting new page that we have in this book, we know that the US can't just undo past damage. We have to build back better with a bold, intersectional feminist foreign policy that centers those most marginalized. And for us, that doesn't only mean sexual and reproductive health and rights, though that's an amazing and important start, but it also means more and better feminist funding that redistributes funding to the local level, leadership and accountability on key issues that are critical to our future, not only those that are traditionally understood as gender justice issues, but we also need to abandon a military first approach. We need to increase aid and promote policies that end capital flight, corruption, tax havens. We need to build a movement from the ground up in the US pertaining to foreign policy, and make sure that it's not just a narrow elite set of policymakers that are driving the agenda, but really that we're supporting grassroots movement leaders with funding, resources, and more to be part of the story of building back better and really thinking about what that looks like together. So I'm so excited to continue the conversation with you all, and I'll pause there because I'm excited to hear more from my fellow panelists on this question as well.
Thank you so much, Lori. I really appreciate the reminder about responding to and taking responsibility for our past as we determine how best to move forward, and the attention you brought to community organizing, local funding, and overall inclusive decision-making. So I'll now move to Malia Luarkie to deliver her remarks.
Good morning. Thank you, Lori and Verena. You guys, that was such a strong beginning. I don't even know how to follow with that, but I guess I'll try. However, my name is Malia Luarkie. I'm from the Pueblo of Laguna. My parents are Richard Luarkie and Carrie Ray. I'm from the village of Parahi. And I'm with Indigenous Women Rising. I am one of the co-founders. I am the birth and breastfeeding lead. I am a full spectrum doula and lactation support. And kind of what our mission, what our Indigenous Women Rising's mission is to commit to honoring Native and Indigenous peoples' inherent right to equitable and culturally safe health options through accessible health education, resources, and advocacy. And circling back to the question of what our key civil priorities for the new administration, you know, I'm very glad the Biden-Harris administration is looking to help us with our priorities. You know, frankly, the priority should focus on families who struggle whose struggles were made more apparent by the pandemic. And families deserve more than a one-time $1,400 payment. And women are bearing the brunt of childcare and our work more than ever right now, and we need relief. We need to see qualified immunity for every state dismantled. That will protect our communities and ensure that if a community insists on having law enforcement will ideally think twice about shooting someone. This is an absolute environmental, reproductive, and racial justice issue. As a Black and Indigenous woman, I deserve protection and dignity. And too often we see property protected over the well-being of people. And this is also an environmental issue when we consume products and food that are produced by low-wage workers who are mostly women in unsafe environments and are forced into production processes that use up our most valuable resources like water, displacing wildlife, destroying ecosystems, and dumping chemicals into water sources, and especially for many reservations who don't have running water, who don't have working electricity. And we're committed to working toward dismantling white supremacy, which includes abolishing law enforcement and institutions created to literally hunt down Indigenous and Black people, people of color. And I really hope the Biden Harris administration really take what we say here today seriously, because I can't do any more panels to assuage white people's guilt, and I want to see action to every level of the government. So that's my piece. I will allow the next panelist to go.
Thanks so much, Malia, for offering your perspective and all the points you raised, both on local communities and environmental issues. So with that, I'll pass the floor to Mara Dolan.
Thanks all. My name's Mara. I use she, her pronouns. I'm just sitting with so much gratitude and I'm really honored to be here. And I was sitting listening to my co-panelists before me and just feeling a lot of appreciation for sharing space with you all. So I think as Spogmay introduced me at the beginning, I work with the Women's Environment and Development Organization, or WEDO, which is a global feminist advocacy organization for gender, environment, and climate advocacy. And as I'll mention a bit later on, much of our work really is in collective and in coalition, and that's a political choice and a political act. So some of those coalitions are the Feminist Green New Deal Coalition and the Women and Gender Constituency, the first of which is a national coalition of gender, racial, economic, and climate justice organizations working towards making the Green New Deal feminist. And the Women and Gender Constituency is a global network of feminists who work within the UN climate negotiation space to do the same thing. And I say all of this because much of what I'll share today has really been learned from these folks, and I'm in really deep appreciation and accountability to their wisdom and their knowledge and leadership. So when I look back on this last year, it's clear that it was a year where the climate crisis really raged around us in increasingly violent ways, right? And it was also compounded by the violence of white supremacy and a global pandemic. So we witnessed catastrophic wildfires and hurricanes and oil spills and the failures of an unweatherized electricity grid. And what we were also witnessing in that, of course, were the devastating effects of centuries of colonialism, patriarchy, and capitalism. And at the end of last year, a really incredible climate journalist that I admire a lot, Mary Heglar, wrote, "We live today in the age of crisis conglomeration. It's no longer useful or honest or even smart to look at any of them through a single lens." And I think as feminists, many of us really resonated with that because we're so used to working at the intersection of crises. And I think the spirit of that is carried through in civil society priorities for the new administration as well. So top line, we know that the climate crisis exacerbates existing inequalities and vulnerabilities, right? And we know that addressing inequality and climate change needs to go hand in hand. So to put it quite simply, from my perspective, the priority is that this administration really address the climate crisis at the scale that both science and justice demand. So we need to see bigger and bolder strides from the administration to address gender, racial, social injustice, and climate as crisis conglomeration, we can't see any of them through a single lens, right? We can't see climate through a single lens. Climate justice is gender justice, is racial justice, is economic justice, and our response and the solutions must see them as such. So let's break this down a little bit. Where are some of the priority areas that a new admin could drive forward through climate justice, through centering racial and economic and gender justice? Where is there really potential for true transformation through policy? So I'll touch briefly on 3 areas. So the first area is really the priority of heeding grassroots feminist and Black and Indigenous leadership on climate solutions. Climate solutions are plentiful, they are community-centered, they are justice-oriented, and they exist everywhere, from mutual aid networks to agroecology practices to collective resource sharing. Folks on the front lines of the climate crisis are and always have been at the forefront of solutions, so heed their leadership. The second priority area is really seeing care work as climate work. Several of my co-panelists have touched on this already, but we're in this moment where it's clear that President Biden and the new administration is ready and willing to invest big in climate action and in care work. That was so clearly at the forefront of the response to COVID-19 and is still at the forefront of the COVID-19 response. But there are very few bridges built between that climate and care policy. So investment in climate action right now looks like hard hats, construction, it looks like building greener buildings. It doesn't look like the work of teaching and nurturing and caring for others, work that we also know is performed overwhelmingly by women and genderqueer folks, especially women of color, and is also work that is underpaid and undervalued. But this work is life-sustaining, right? It's life-giving, and it's also work that is central to the world that we need to transition to in order to actually address the climate crisis. Work that is low carbon, community-centered, and aimed at providing dignified, healthy lives for all. So care jobs are green jobs, period. Care infrastructure is infrastructure. So to put justice at its center, climate action from the new administration must really put care at its center. And then the third bucket is really financing transformation. It's no secret that climate justice, in order for it to be achieved, we need a fundamental shift in the dominant economic model, which the US is a major driver of and a big believer in. If we don't shift finance now, we're only funding future cycles of harm and violence, right? We've got to divest from fossil fuels, from the military-industrial complex, including police, from all of these institutions that are built on extraction and white supremacy, right? They're not commensurate with a livable future. The admin can't continue to greenlight fossil fuel infrastructure projects like Line 3 in Minnesota I'll lift up, and allowing fossil fuel companies to really threaten Indigenous sovereignty and the health of our communities and our futures. So polluters need to pay. Reparations need to be instituted nationally and globally. The US as an administration needs to pay its fair share to the rest of the world for the really outsized impact that we've had in the climate crisis. This means at bare minimum, the $8 billion that we've committed to the Green Climate Fund, but of course, this isn't encompassing the broader shift that we really need to divest from harm and invest in social protections and care. And 100% of this finance should be gender responsive, right? It should support local women's orgs, eco-feminist efforts in the US and around the world. So a good investment in climate action is one that prioritizes a just and livable future and puts people over profit. And I'll just wrap up here by saying that reiterating that these 3 priorities, heeding grassroots leadership, seeing care work as climate work, and financing transformation, they are not the end of the road. They're instead really gonna lay the groundwork for so much else that can come after. So thanks, back to you, Spogmay.
Thanks so much, Mara, for dropping your knowledge. I love the focus you brought to care as central to the world that we need to transition to, and the intersections you laid out between all of these issues, as well as science and justice. So I want to now shift to the second question for the whole panel. It's been really helpful to think about your priorities, and I now want us to push a little bit deeper and think about actual policy recommendations and implementation. So based off of the priorities you've all outlined, how can the administration's policies and programs really effectively advance intersectionality and inclusion And what steps can it take to ensure that the most marginalized communities, including those most affected by the COVID-19 crisis, are prioritized and central to all decision-making and response? So to respond, I'll first pass it to Verena. Still muted. Got it.
Sorry, was not allowing me to unmute myself. Thank you both for the question. Thank you for all of the really insightful interventions just now. I was actually thinking about this question as you were talking. I don't know if folks caught this, but last week, because it's been just such a blur, it's been March, and I think everybody kind of runs around with everything just on fire. But last Friday, which was of course in the middle of CSW, we also marked the International Day for the Elimination of Racism. And our ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, gave just an incredible speech. Really, if you haven't read it, really encourage you to find it. It's on the US UN website. And so now I'm kind of quoting from memory, so forgive me if I butcher what she said. But she said in her speech, we can't change the hate in people's hearts, but we can change the rules that give them license. And so I think if I were a better yoga or meditation practitioner, this would be the mantra I think that I would repeat to myself over and over again, because I think it just so perfectly captures one of the most powerful ways that the department can affect change. So of course, our three tools are diplomacy, policy, and programming. And I think if we want to kind of concretely tie these to our policy priorities, I think GBV, or gender-based violence, is a really good example of just actions taken in the last week or two. So on policy, of course, our new EO that I mentioned at the top asks us to put forward a new strategy to prevent and respond to GBV at home and globally. And so that's a big step forward. We had a GBV strategy globally that I actually worked on back in 2012 that we updated in 2016. And so this will be a big step forward in order for us to think about policy issues that have emerged, such as online violence, cyber violence, that have really surged since we first drafted that strategy. And I think we can centralize the lived experiences of those who have experienced violence as appropriate, and I want to really caveat that, by working with civil society and with advocates in a more consultative process to get us to that new strategy. And then diplomatically, I mentioned IWOC at the top. We were thrilled to hear this past week that one of our IWOC awardees, Mufgan Khatun of Nepal, she's the survivor of an acid attack and a champion for human rights in her country. She was actually honored this past week by her president. And the government of Nepal has moved up the trial of her attackers and committed to strengthening legislation against acid attacks. And so diplomatically, the spotlight that we're able to shine on individuals and on their stories as a reflection or as a framing of larger issues, I think is a role that we're proud to play and that we can play. And then of course, programmatically, we will continue, as I mentioned at the top, to provide funding on these issues, not only through my own office and our collaboration with, we have our Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor Bureau. We made an announcement last week on funding for the Voices Against Violence initiative, which will be particularly looking at those affected by COVID-related violence, but also working in conjunction with others across the administration. I think the last thing I would say is we know we have affirmed and we will continue to do so that all efforts to address GBV have to be inclusive of those who are at heightened risk. And COVID has really only exacerbated these realities. So we're lots to do. I think Laurie talked about the page in the book. There are, I think, hopefully a lot of pages in this particular chapter.
I really appreciate that reflection, and I'm glad to hear about the focus on working with civil society and advocates throughout the term. So I'll hand it back to Laurie.
Thank you so much. And it's a great question, because when it comes to how to really support intersectionality and center these communities through policy, I think that's where we really see the limitations of representation. Right? Representation is not enough. Having certain folks in certain roles is not going to get us there when it comes to that structural change. And so at Global Fund for Women, we've really seen one area that can be really catalytic when it comes to making structural change is funding, and not just where or how much, but also the how of funding. And so this isn't always the sexiest topic that everyone, is wanting to talk about, but I think it's a really important one. More and more donors, including and especially governments, are understanding this, that how you give can be as important as where you give. And so some recent high-profile gifts from individual donors, I think very notably Mackenzie Scott, that were flexible, unrestricted donations. These practices align with the principles of feminist funding, which are trust-based, flexible, and core funding to those most impacted by marginalization, so that they can lead the change they seek. Because ultimately, we are not going to see that structural change, even if we all individually do our best within our roles to support and serve different and historically marginalized communities. If those structures are still in place, we're not going to get there. And so we actually need to stop setting top-down agendas for these communities and empower them with funding and resources to make their own decisions. And I think COVID has really highlighted the importance of this in really powerful and very tangible ways. Women and local feminist groups were absolutely critical to the frontline response to the pandemic. They are driving recovery efforts. Unless you had a crystal ball, you did not have a line item in your budget for COVID-19 in 2019. And if flexible funding was a part of your planning, those groups could allocate that funding and be flexible immediately to shift from whatever maybe in-person programming that they had going on to digital programming to meet the needs of their communities. We've been talking about violence against women. We know that domestic violence skyrocketed during COVID, and women and a lot of feminist local groups were leaders and had a lot of resources and responses around domestic violence. Were they necessarily funded in that budget line for violence against women, or were they empowered to use whatever funds they had at their disposal to meet the needs of their communities? And when it comes down to it, the how of funding, I think, is a really critical part of the diversity and intersectionality conversation, because we don't want to be thinking so much about intersectional identities as we do about intersectional struggles and how we can address those at the structural level. And so, we hear this stat, but I really think it's mind-blowing. Only 2.1% of international humanitarian assistance goes directly to locally run organizations, and only 1% of gender equality funding trickles down to women-led grassroots organizations. And if there's one policy that we can change that would really have a catalytic effect, I would say that this is it, because no matter what we're doing, if we're still setting that agenda, it's not going to go as far as if the communities could set that agenda for themselves.
Amazing, thank you. Love hearing about not just who and what we give to, but how that funding is issued, and really great reminder about the importance of structural change in acknowledging intersectionality and how to really implement the terms we use into the work that we do. So with that, I will pass it back to Malia.
Thank you. Dang, y'all are so good. Okay, so let's see. Let me just get my mind back to what I was going to talk about. So as Verena and Lori said, we really need to include or go beyond including Black and Indigenous people or migrant people, or I guess immigrant people. And we really must be trusted to use our expertise to answer these questions according to what our communities need and want. It doesn't make sense to only have us as representatives and continue to carry on with the same policies that hurt people and exploit the land. We challenge this new administration to put their money where their mouths are and invest in our leadership, and know that just because many of us are not scientists or economists, that doesn't mean we don't know how to protect our environment. We don't know how to take care of our communities. There are Black, Indigenous, and migrant farmers all over the country that are institutionally marginalized and don't get the kind of support they need or deserve. In fact, Senator Lindsey Graham insinuated that Black farmers shouldn't be given equitable support, not equal support, but equitable. We want our government to acknowledge that equality isn't enough. And, you know, Black and Indigenous people, migrant relatives who are coming to this country for a better life, low income folks in Appalachia, unsheltered people, incarcerated people, we should have been the first to get tested, get medical care, get vaccinated, get housed. You know, and last year, Britain showed the world we could use our resources to house unsheltered people. South Korea prioritized government acquisition of PPE and did thorough contact tracing. Indigenous communities all over the Americas launched mutual aid programs to ensure our relatives could get masks, menstrual hygiene products, condoms, and breastfeeding supplies where it was most needed. And we have so much to learn from the communities we don't listen to and the rest of the world when it comes to policies that help people survive. And quite frankly, it's disgusting to say this, but the Trump administration sent the Navajo Nation body bags when they asked for PPE. And that was a great example of how these groups have been treated by the federal government, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. And I'm suggesting that this administration not only listen to us, but again, invest in our expertise and trust us to take care of our communities. At Indigenous Women Rising, we do our best to live by the framework of reproductive justice as developed by Sister Song and the definition of intersectionality as defined by Kimberly Crenshaw. You know, and this means that all families, regardless of their legal status in this country or whether they are incarcerated, deserve dignity. And I will pass to the next person.
Thank you so much, Malia. I love what you said about having to learn so much from the communities that we don't listen to, and also the concepts you brought up around deservingness and who decides what or who is deserving versus the concept of rights and rights to all. So I'm also going to pass it back to Mara.
Thanks, Spogmay. I'm learning so much listening to you all, and I feel like I want to start out by saying just a lot of resonance with what Lori and Malia just shared around all of their interventions, but I think I'm really resonating in particular with Lori's point around sort of the power of resourcing and the question of sort of resourcing as indicative of where power can be redistributed and where leadership can lie. So that also ties very clearly in for me with Malia's point around challenging the top-down understanding of expertise that so often policymaking has, and knowing, you know, expertise is lived, it is generational, it is knowledge in so many forms. And it's time that our policymaking and our writing process reflects the expertise held by frontline communities and resource this work, as Lori pointed out. So I think for me, the quote that came to me sort of right away when I read this question for the first time is just, my feminism will be intersectional or it will fail. And I think that has to be sort of at the core of all of the work that we push forward. So I'll start here with some very clear asks for the administration that they could implement this afternoon if they wanted, and then conclude with some broader pieces around how I think feminist and climate justice movements encourage us to think about how to advance intersectionality and inclusion within policy processes. So we know that the global framework for action on climate change, including, of course, the Paris Agreement, which the new administration has signed back onto, have firmly recognized that to be effective and truly transformative, climate action must respect and promote gender equality and the rights of women and girls in all of their diversity. So coming from this, WEDO and a number of our allies put forward a brief at the beginning of this year on the effective integration of gender equality into US high-level White House climate change policymaking, coordination and structure. And there were two sort of key recommendations there that I think are key to advancing intersectionality and inclusion within the new administration. And the first of those is really to appoint, as many countries have done, a national gender and climate change lead to support integration of intersectional gender considerations into all aspects of White House climate change policymaking and coordination. So this looks like a whole of government effort that that is accountable to a person who I'll speak to in a few moments, also needs to be accountable to movements. And the second recommendation is really ensuring that effective integration of gender equality considerations and human rights are really clear and at the center of the US Nationally Determined Contribution, the NDC for short. So on that first recommendation, which is a mandate to countries under the UN, here I call back to the priority in my previous comments around heeding the leadership of grassroots feminists and really knowing if there is a national gender and climate change lead in the White House, how can we build accountability bridges? Can they push for feminist solutions and feminist financing and resourcing that we need while being in relationship and deep accountability to movements outside of the White House? This would be a really pivotal step towards ensuring that there is a voice championing intersectional feminist climate analysis in the admin and across climate teams. And on the second recommendation, I think, nationally determined contributions are really the roadmap that we lay out for our national paths to climate action. And they are imperfect and they are non-binding, but they are a mechanism through which we indicate to ourselves and to the rest of the world what our priorities are, how we plan to do this, what matters to us, and who we will support in our process to transform for climate action. And we know that the administration is currently writing the US NDC and don't know much about it yet. So can hope and continue to demand that it's being written through, is being written with the utmost transparency and consultation and with the intention to really co-generate it with marginalized communities. And now to sort of zoom out a little bit, yesterday in another ICRW event, actually, the fierce feminist foreign policy champion Lyric Thompson said, and I hope I'm not misquoting you, it's about feminist process, not just feminist content. And I want to bring those words into this conversation as well, because I think they hold so true in pushing the how and the who of how the administration's work advances intersectionality within climate policy. And for me, I think, feminist process, in order to lead to feminist content, is about seeing power as collective. As I mentioned at the top, much of WEDO's most powerful work, I think, comes out of collective action, whether it's with partners in the US Feminist Green New Deal Coalition or partners globally in the Women and Gender constituency, pushing for climate justice at the UN. Feminism demands collective action and movement building and a move away from individualism or saviorism. And that is a political act. So here I would say, to advance intersectionality and inclusion within the administration should take collective power seriously. It's a gift where work has been done by civil society to lay collective roadmaps, priorities, build broad united fronts and consensus around the work that needs to be done. Policies can learn from this, they can build from this. And consultation and co-generation for policy is most powerful coming out of and with collectives. So I'll conclude there and pass back to you, Spogmay.
Thanks so much, Mara, for really clearly articulating a lot of those policy recommendations and also bridging together a lot of key important points around leadership, financing, accountability, and also just what leadership means and looks like, whether it's at within our government or in communities, and hitting on a lot of the points that all of the other panelists have made. So those are all of my questions. Thank you all so much for shedding your insights and sharing your wisdom. It's really valuable for me and hopefully for others in the audience to learn from your experiences and the work that you do every day. And thank you for that work. So we have lots of time to take audience questions. So as a reminder, if you have a question, please feel free to type it into the Q&A function or the chat, and we are compiling them on our end, and we'll hopefully get a chance to ask the questions you've posed. So I'll start with one for the entire panel, and then we have a couple of questions directed more to specific speakers. So for the panel as a whole, what concrete practices can we put in place to really work across silos and handle issues of intersectionality and inclusion? A couple of you have already spoken about the power in working in collective and the importance of coalition building. And you've also raised really key points between bridging local and domestic issues with the global women's rights movement as a whole. So I'll open the floor for anybody who wants to take that question.
I can jump in and welcome others to do so as well, but totally agree and want to plus one. I still snap when I hear something that I appreciate. So I've been doing that all day today. And I think it's really important not to get stuck in the silos and the boxes. So even if you work at an organization or have a specific passion around, let's say, gender justice, you must also lift up and speak up around, say, climate change and find those intersections and lift those up and work collectively. So, you know, I really appreciate today that there are lots of different viewpoints represented on this panel, and Global Fund for Women was very thrilled to join ICRW and more than 100 organizations and counting to sign on to a set of recommendations around feminist foreign policy that are really intersectional. So it's not only about, you know, enacting the Global Her Act to permanently end the global gag rule and repealing the Helms Amendment, but it's also about enacting the GLOBE Act to build a framework into US diplomacy to protect LGBTQ human rights, and, you know, also increasing foreign aid assistance levels. And so I think we need to get beyond the silo. Yes, we want to see sexual and reproductive health and rights advance, but we cannot only advocate for those issues because people don't experience the world like, okay, I am having sexual and reproductive health and rights needs now. As a woman, you know, that's not how real life happens. There are no, you know, single issue lives, as Audre Lorde says. And so, you know, we really need to put that into practice and not let ourselves get boxed in as, well, okay, I'm the gender person, so I can't talk about race.
Yes.
So I mean, I can jump.
All this. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead,
I just
Malia.
jumped in right after you. I'm so sorry. I was trying to give her all the snaps and all the gratitude, but yeah, it's just kind of what Lori was saying. You know, for Native and Indigenous people, everything is connected, right? Everything is connected. From everything we do, from the land to the air, to the water, to the trees, to the food that's on our plate, everything is connected. And like Lori said, not getting so boxed in and just caught in our one issue, right? Because as women or people who identify as women, we go through everything all at once, and it just, you know, happens to be at one of the most inconvenient times, and it happens so quick, so fast, and sometimes it's here and then it's gone, and then it's here and then it's gone, you know. So just acknowledging that, you know, like Lori said, do not get caught up in the little box or the, I guess, what it's supposed to be in the box. And, you know, really acknowledging that everything does flow together, acknowledging everything all at once. And, you know, for IWR, or Indigenous Women Rising, we really try to acknowledge that, especially within our different Native and Indigenous communities, because we're all different. And though we all have very much the same values, appreciating the land, our women, our children, and our men, and so on, so Lori said it perfectly. Okay, sorry, Verena, go ahead.
No, I think my role on this panel, maybe now as a government representative, is to give a little bit more of a boring answer. So I'll have to kind of ask your forgiveness in advance. But I do think, like, how to say this, having spent 4 years outside of government from 2017 to earlier this year, and now coming back in, I think I have a couple of new and different observations coming back in a second time. But one of the most important has really been sort of watching from the outside for the last 4 years, how deeply policy is personnel and personnel is policy. And so I think so taking the Gender Policy Council as a really good example, because I saw a couple of questions go by in the chat. The Gender Policy Council isn't in the Vice President's office. It's not in the First Lady's office. It's its own office. And it is charged through this executive order to very specifically coordinate with the kind of what I would call of 3 of the very most important bodies that sort of direct the president's policymaking, right? So they're charged with collaborating with the Domestic Policy Council. They're charged with collaborating with the National Security Council, which is, of course, where I sit in the State Department, where we sort of interface. And they're also, to build on the comments here about budgeting and resources, they're also charged with coordinating with the director of OMB. So I think a second observation I would have as coming back into government, of course, is that government is it's a very, very, very large ship, and it turns slowly, right? But if you look at the EO, there is some helpful and new language in there that we were pleased to see and have been talking about for a long time about gender budgeting, which is not something that the US government has done in the past. But I think over the course of the 4 years or 8 years that this may be, hopefully we'll have some ways to sort of effectively translate personnel as policy also as through our budget. That, of course, will have to be done always in consultation and coordination with Congress. Of course, they sort of obviously hold the purse strings at the end of the day, and I know many advocates on this call know Congress far better than I ever have or ever will. But I do go back to, when you think about silos, the Gender Policy Council is a really, really critical example of domestic and international, not just the policy arms, but also the funding. And I think to sort of expand on that a little bit, I pulled up the list of the people who are going to have to be reporting to the Gender Policy Council. So the point on we need somebody who's gender and climate, and somebody who's really actually quite seized with this. So the people who are going to be having to meet with the GPC and reporting with them, Secretaries of State, Treasury, Agriculture, Transportation, and Energy, as well as, and these were specifically called out, EPA, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, the Office of the Assistant to the President on National Climate, so the National Climate Advisor, the Chair of the Council on Environmental Quality, the Director of the National Science Foundation, the Administrator of USAID. For State Department, we'll be sending, of course, our Ambassador for Global Women's Issues. But each of these people are going to have to identify and find somebody who's going to be charged and seized with this agenda as well. And I think, to me, that's a really critical and powerful statement, again, to go back to personnel as policy.
And I'll just jump in here with a couple final thoughts on breaking down silos, because I think this question is so key, and it's I think a question that animates a lot of our work within feminist organizations and the feminist movement. It's also interesting because I do feel like movements at this point are better at this than than government institutions are. And I think that policy processes can really learn from the ways that movements already have been working to really break down some of these silos that exist, even when those silos are then reflected in government. So I think about sort of the Feminist Green New Deal as a great example of this. As a coalition, the coalition is working to gather folks who work at the intersection of climate justice, through all of the ways that the climate crisis touches our lives, and it touches all of them, right? It touches on migrant justice, reproductive justice, racial justice, economic justice. So if we are going to gather around influencing climate policy, we need to break down all of those silos. And I think when we think about what climate policy looks like in government, those same lessons need to be learned. And I think this is where I'm really excited about the role that feminist organizations and the feminist movement can play in, I think, actually being a real leader in sort of the broader movement ecosystem on this, because I think we've done it so well. You know, issues of demilitarization, feminists have something to say. It's a feminist issue. Issues of mass incarceration, feminists have something to say. It's a feminist issue. Economic policy, labor policy, feminists have something to say. So I think in the ways that sometimes policy-driven processes can only consult with one community, or sort of only consult with one sector or one part of the movement landscape that seem to have direct inputs, feminists have something to say about all of them, because as Laurie said, no one lives single issue lives. So in terms of breaking down silos, I would say follow the lead of feminist organizations and the feminist movement, because we've been working to do it for decades. And I think it's key to building any sort of intersectional policy and analysis that comes out of movement-led work.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for sharing your perspectives from multiple angles. We've gotten lots of questions for Verena, and I think you actually addressed quite a few of them in your comments just now. But I want to ask if you could elaborate a little bit on how the new administration and the White House Gender Policy Council is altering the way that the Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues is working within the State Department, and whether you might have a time frame on the new ambassador.
I saw that question from Susan pop up, and I wish I had. I'll be very blunt, maybe not the best example of diplomacy, but be very blunt and say I don't actually have a timeline. I know, of course, that actually my former boss, Ambassador Kathy Russell, is of course the head of PPO, or I don't know what PPO is, Presidential Personnel Office. And so I know that she's quite seized with this. She obviously cares really, really deeply about the person that they end up nominating. It's my understanding, just from talking to people in the community, not talking to Ambassador Russell herself, but of course there's a high degree of interest, not only in who this person will be, but in being that person. So I think that it's just been a long process of considering potential names and who this person might eventually be. And of course, even when they're nominated, they'll have to go through the Senate confirmation process. So I can't speak to a specific timeline. My hope is, of course, that we'll get somebody sooner rather than later. And I think that the White House would agree with that. In terms of how the current structure alters I wasn't here for the past 4 years, so I really can't speak to the change between the previous administration and this current administration. I will say that the interaction and the sort of, I would say, daily, sometimes hourly, minute by minute interaction between the GPC and GWE, as we call it, my office, GWE, is really, really, really strong. And I can only imagine that will get stronger with a new ambassador. And as we sort of, as the GPC Council builds out, I think since the date of March 8th, which was when the executive order was released, all of these different agencies have about 30 days to submit their nominations to affect the council. And so that will be, I think, a big and important step forward in terms of actually constituting what the GPC is. But in terms of coordination, collaboration, we're just, it's been a fantastic working relationship. I'm sure many of you have seen them or heard them speak or have worked with them in previous lives. Susan, I know that's of course true for you. They're really just deeply kind, thoughtful leaders in this space, and we're lucky to work with them.
Thanks so much, Verena. That's really useful to hear. I have a question now for all panelists, going back to a point that Lori had raised in her remarks on only 1% of funding trickling down to local organizations and the systemic inequities that keep blocking meaningful progress. So what can we do to create a shift in this? And how do we convince funders of the return on investment, perhaps even non-traditional? I'll allow anyone to take that, so go ahead and.
Sure, I can jump on that particular question. I think it goes back to some of the things I was already talking about, right? I think we already have the steers internally within the government through this executive order to start at least examining our funding, and to do it in a way that is hopefully a little bit more gender sensitive or gender transformative. Second, I think advocates will understand the rules of the road much better than I do, but engaging with Congress, engaging with members is incredibly powerful. I don't know if those of you who were or if anybody watched Samantha Power's confirmation yesterday. It was quite powerful, and I think the questions that those senators asked, I think, are a good indication of where one of our largest, at least international development funders' attention will lie, and we can. Advocates and organizations and those paying attention can certainly be a neck that turns the head a little bit. So I would say those are the big things that I think of. I think that Lori, you talked about. I'm going to blank on her last name, but Mackenzie. Yes, her last name. I mean, I was part of a different organization when her announcements came out, but that was incredible, and it really tracks, I think, alongside one of the ongoing discussions that we were in as, and I'm speaking from my former organization's hat, as a funded organization from two big international development donors. Really grappling in a different way with this concept of decolonizing development and what that looks like. And her announcement, I think, was quite big and a big bold step. And I know Global Fund were part of that as well. So that was great to see. But for government, I think it's certainly Congress, it's gender budgeting, it's working with OMB, working very specifically at the State Department with what we call our corporate units, or our F and VP structures. And our office is ready and willing and has already developed sort of what are those questions that we would ask when we're conducting a gender analysis? What are the things that others could do? So we'll be working on that for the next 4 years.
I love to hear that, Verena, and really want to offer the Women's Funds community, not only Global Fund for Women, as a resource, because, as I think many of my fellow panelists have been saying, the women's movement and gender justice movements do have a blueprint for a lot of this work. And, I gave the example of Mackenzie Scott, and I gave some COVID examples. I also think this funding comes into play when other kinds of disasters, unfortunately. So we've seen this recently in Myanmar with human rights and gender justice activists resisting oppressive state tactics, and the recent military coup at a great personal cost. Police officers have been ordered to kill protesters, and what we're seeing with our grantee partners is that they are seeking support to cover costs for safe houses, relocation, setting up CCTVs, securing documentation on human rights violations. All of these things, the how and the flexible funding, that's really what gender transformative or gender sensitive funding can mean. So I'm excited to hear about the interest there. And you know, I think when it comes to Congress and bringing more people on board with this, Mackenzie Scott gift can be a really great turning point. There are also examples at the government level. So we're partnering with another multi-regional fund, the Equality Fund, based in Canada, who have seen a new kind of funding come through and go directly, you know, a significant amount of funding go directly to grassroots gender justice groups and movements around the world. And so we're starting to get data and information from that that can help continue to make the case. Because when you hear these examples, COVID, Myanmar, even Mackenzie Scott, so much of this is common sense. You know, how can I, sitting in New York, make a decision about what's needed in another place and know best. And so there's a lot of data and common sense that I think we can put into practice here. And the last thing that I'll say is that I think the State Department has made gains in these areas already to a small scale. So, you know, what we saw is, I would say in the 80s, there was a push around getting more funding to go through local missions. And what would it mean if local missions were empowered just to distribute a small percentage of their funding through a trust-based model without having to go through you know, some more traditional protocol. And, you know, I think that we can look at some of these small steps and hopefully continue to build on them and make the case in a number of ways for this landscape to shift.
I'll just jump in here to add, I'm in total agreement with my co-panelists, and I think the only thing that I would really add is that, you know, in a lot of WEDO's work around shifting climate finance specifically towards being more feminist, and we use the language of feminist financing because as we've touched on, you know, the transformation necessary to address the climate crisis will require shifts in trillions of dollars from institutions of harm towards investments in social protections and care. So I think climate finance is a huge piece of this, and we see many of the same trends around that money not being delivered or being sort of given to the agency of feminist organizations and women's organizations and locally led organizations. And three of the questions that we often, and here I'll shout out my colleague Tara Daniel at WEDO, who has led on a lot of this work around feminist financing at the national level. Three of the questions that she often encourages asking in conversation with governments around their climate finance plans and how to make them more feminist is, you know, first really starting with where is the money going and are these mechanisms fit to support feminist solutions? So this means probably entering into conversation around risks and limitations of contributions to multilateral development banks. It means shifting substantial portions of multilateral finance into climate funds like the Green Climate Fund and the Adaptation Fund. And then the second question would be something along the lines of what kinds of alternatives and innovative delivery mechanisms are you able to envision? Are we able to envision? And I think here, you know, to support catalytic advancements in climate work and gender equality, we need to be funding those bilateral efforts that actually invest in women's rights and feminist organizing. And as Laurie has pointed out, strategizing how to ensure that that flow of funds gets to the local level. And then thirdly, you know, what are the key challenges that are in front of us in the normative thinking around climate finance that we need to actually shift in order to advance them being more feminist? So this means, you know, reframing risk. It means recognizing what true innovation in mitigation and adaptation efforts are that are so often feminist-led, grassroots women-led, and building momentum for the kinds of catalytic investments that we need around climate action and gender equality there. So I hope those three questions, though I answered your question with three more questions, I hope that those are useful in sort of thinking through how advocacy around climate finance links to feminist financing.
Those are all really useful responses and great to see a lot of agreement across your remarks. I am going to ask a couple of questions to Verena since we are getting so many for you. I'll combine the two that we've got. So we have one on hearing more about the administration's plans to tackle cyber violence in particular and how to successfully regulate such a rapidly changing sector. And we also have a question on whether the US is taking additional actions to implement the SRHR recommendations from the Universal Periodic Review, if you can answer that.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of cyber or online violence, I mentioned that kind of off the cuff as just a good example of something that really has shifted a lot since 2012 to now. We are just in the beginning phases of drafting this, and I think you're right. It is something that shifts a lot. Luckily, again, personnel is policy, and so we do have ties into communities that have greater depth of knowledge onto this. I will say, even just getting onto today's Zoom was a bit of a challenge. So the government isn't necessarily always, for security reasons and other reasons, the most up to date on tech. So we'll be relying, I think, a lot on folks who know this issue, study this issue deeply. And it's not obviously just cyber online violence that we'll have to be considering in this. I think that the eventual strategy, and I wanted to talk to another question I saw pop in the chat to this in this answer as well. The eventual GBV strategy will of course have to take on not just individual issues, but also new framings, right? So COVID, of course, is a new framing, a new reality. And I've seen, reports that if we don't sort of address this, we're going to see a generation of losses for women and girls. And so these are all the kinds of things that, as we're thinking about drafting, that will need to go into it. There was a question also about like, this is a lot of strategies. They all don't necessarily talk to each other, and there are national action plans, and there's so I'm maybe misquoting it because I don't have it right in front of me. But what is exciting to me, and what does actually have a deadline, when the EO came out, we have 200 days to write basically a gender policy strategy, and this is domestic and it's international. So that deadline is late September, right around UNGA time, and within that strategy, I think we have an opportunity to make all of the other ones talk to each other, if that makes sense. In terms of SRHR, I'm not exactly sure what the question was, but of course, the reason why I mentioned it, and the reason why I mentioned it as a priority, of course, is again, the fundamental nature of it to women's empowerment and girls' empowerment, but also because of, again, the framing that we're in now. UNFPA, I think it was last week or maybe the week before that, just released a report that states that an estimated 12 million women have now experienced disrupted access to family planning services, 1.4 million unintended pregnancies as a result. We know that leads to unsafe abortion, to maternal and child deaths. And of course, this all builds on the pre-existing conditions of, pre-pandemic, 218 million women having an unmet need for contraception. So in addition to, I think, taking the necessary steps that we outlined here, we'll be looking throughout the next 4 or 8 years to continue to build on the kinds of commitments like to UNFPA, and in terms of rescinding the Mexico City policy to sort of safeguard this fundamental aspect of women and girls' lives, everybody's life, really.
So much. I have a couple of interesting questions that I'm going to try my best to combine and present to you all, but you've all hit on a lot of important points around how personnel is policy, but I think often personnel and representation do not always mean the same things. So we have a few questions on how perhaps we may be appointing or advancing things like gender parity or diversity and inclusion in these institutions, but overall they're still stuck in systems of male dominance and colonialism and exclusion and are not necessarily representative. And somebody brought up in the comments a question particularly around our vice president and how a lot of people grapple with the difficulty of some parts of her professional background and working as a prosecutor, and how that may not necessarily be the most representative for some feminist groups. So how exactly do we reconcile these issues from a number of means? When we're advancing parity, how do we ensure that our personnel are also advancing the issues that are important to feminists and to feminist leaders? And particularly for the women of color on the panel, this question is asking, how do we reconcile celebrating women of color being in leadership positions, but also being concerned about some parts of their background and how it may not necessarily be the most tied to feminist principles today? So I'll leave that open to anyone who wants to hop in.
I just know Malia has thoughts on this. Do you want to go first, Malia, or you want me to try to take a stab at some of this? Okay, well, jump in, because I think especially like as women of color working in, international issues, global issues, you do think about these things constantly. They're constantly there. Development is a colonial hangover. We know this, we need to say this. And our sector has long failed to acknowledge the historic exploitation that created vulnerable populations that we aim to serve to begin with. And I think especially as a woman of color feminist, we have long critiqued the race blindness of gender empowerment efforts. Malia shouted out Sister Song, shouted out the reproductive justice framework. These are really powerful intersectional frameworks created by women of color with a global perspective, but they're still not, they haven't been mainstreamed in a way, especially by the gender equity industrial complex, as these should be. I spoke earlier in the session around the limitations around representation, and obviously that's relevant here, but I think what is really important is, to take it away from the focus on the individual and, really think about the systemic and the structural. And what I am most passionate about is bringing back an internationalist solidarity to American politics that we desperately need in order to interrupt the elitism of foreign policy and development today. We need to build a movement from the ground up in the US that's concerned with foreign policy, so that foreign policy is not largely shaped by a narrow elite of policymakers, whether those narrow elite are people of color or not people of color, really being besides the point. I remember when the global gag rule was repealed, we reached out to Dr. Joya Creer-Perry, who's the founder and president of the National Birth Equity Collaborative in the United States. And we wanted to connect with her because we know that in the US, Black women remain 3 to 4 times more likely to die in childbirth than their white counterparts. And in other westernized nations, the disparities are higher, but it's really important as US-based feminists of color, when we're advocating for global issues or foreign policy issues, that we recognize those realities. This is not a zero-sum game, and we as Black women need to be worldwide in the fight for reproductive justice together. And so all of this to say, obviously this is hitting a lot for me. There's a lot to unpack here, but what I think it does boil down to is that we need more multiracial coalitions in the US holding our governments accountable around not only these issues in the US, but also globally. And we need to connect the dots. For example, both the global gag rule and Helms have had serious implications both in the US and globally. So the global gag rule, first they came for the global communities, then they brought it home in the US when they saw, wow, we can really get away with this. We can have a global gag rule in the US and most people haven't even heard of it, don't know about it. We're not seeing protests in the streets about it as a racial justice issue, let alone as a gender justice issue, when it is very deeply both. And the average American doesn't understand the scope and the breadth of these many, many, many millions of dollars and how it's impacting communities of color around the world. And so all of that to say, I think we really need to have these conversations, and I appreciate the question, and representation absolutely, will not save us.
Yes, yes to all of that. Dang. So, okay, let me figure out something else I can say because you just hit the nail on the head. But like Lori said, representation, though, is very, very important. It needs to be also paired with decision-making power, and we definitely should be in solidarity with the feminists worldwide. However, there's the fact that Harris was a prosecutor, as said, and she made it, a lot harder to keep sex workers safe by prosecuting them, and in doing so, and I guess specifically with Black and immigrant families, and those are groups we really care about, and like I said, representation does matter. However, again, decision making is also a huge factor, and I think Lori just put it beautifully. And it is nice to see her there, but we also there's something bigger than that, so we also have to pay attention again to the decision making and to all, I guess, just that in general. So
Thank you both so much for those insights. And we have 1 minute remaining, and I believe this platform will kick us off once we hit 12 p.m. So I just want to really thank you all so much for joining this panel, for sharing your insights, your knowledge, and all of the policies that are being considered by the administration and how civil society will be hopefully a part of the policy formation. So if this event leaves you with anything, I hope it's some optimism that moving forward, we can engage in really productive dialogue between government and civil society. It's been a tough year, and it's shown us a lot about the need for equitable and inclusive decision-making. So this conversation has given me a lot of hope that there's a lot of amazing work being done, and hopefully we'll carry forward and advance our vision of equitable, inclusive leadership and intersectionality, inclusion, and all the amazing concepts that have been raised in today's conversation. So thank you all so much. Thank you to the audience for joining, and enjoy the rest of the events this week, and stay safe and healthy.